Close your eyes and picture a knight. You probably see him clearly. Tall and heroic, with sunlight glinting off his perfectly polished suit of armor. He is the central figure in 1,000 years of fairy tales and legends, the very symbol of nobility and courage. He rides a powerful white warhorse, his family's colorful banner flying proudly in the wind. He is on his way to complete a noble quest, perhaps to rescue a princess from a high tower, slay a terrifying dragon, or win a glorious tournament for honor and fame. This is the knight we know from movies and books. He is chivalrous, kind to the weak, and merciless to his enemies. He lives in a grand castle, dines at long tables filled with food, and is admired by all. His life is one of adventure and purpose. We imagine his world as a place of clear good and evil, where honor is the highest currency, and a strong sword arm can solve any problem. It's a romantic, exciting, and deeply appealing vision of the past, a world we almost wish we could visit. But this image, this entire beautiful, shining picture of the medieval knight, is almost completely wrong. It is a fantasy, a carefully constructed story we've been telling ourselves for centuries, because the truth is far less glamorous and far more miserable. The reality of being a knight was not a life of chivalrous adventure. It was a life of profound discomfort, constant financial anxiety, brutal violence, and an overwhelming, ever-present stench. It was, in short, a truly terrible job. So get comfortable, settle in, and let us begin a journey back in time, not to the world of myth, but to the real world of the Middle Ages. We are going to strip away the shining armor to see the suffering man inside. We will explore the day-to-day reality of this supposedly glorious life. From the crushing weight of the armor to the crushing weight of debt. From the terrors of the battlefield to the equally terrifying diseases that haunted every military camp. This is not a story of heroes and villains. It's a story of what it was really like to do one of the most dangerous and overrated jobs in human history. A job that was far more about survival than it was about glory. Tonight, we're going to shatter the myth. We're going to look past the epic poems and the Hollywood blockbusters to understand the gritty, painful, and often disgusting truth. We are going to learn why it really, truly sucked to be a knight. The popular image of a knight shows him as a wealthy aristocrat, living a life of leisure when not engaged in heroic deeds. This idea suggests that all knights were powerful lords with vast lands and endless coffers of gold. We assume that becoming a knight was the ultimate promotion, a ticket to a life of comfort and respect. That once you earned your spurs, your financial worries were over, and you could focus entirely on the noble arts of war and love. This financial security is central to the knightly myth. He can afford the best armor, the strongest horse, and the finest clothes because his status automatically grants him wealth. He is part of the 1% of the medieval world. But this assumption of universal wealth is perhaps the biggest lie of all. The reality for a huge number of knights was not one of riches, but of constant grinding and desperate financial struggle. Many knights were, in fact, incredibly poor. They were often land poor, possessing a title and a small estate that produced just enough to survive, but not enough to truly thrive or afford the massive expenses of their profession. Their status came with crippling obligations. So let's put aside the image of the wealthy lord and his castle. The truth is much more complicated and much more stressful. Being a knight was not a guarantee of wealth. For many, it was a guarantee of debt. The path to knighthood was not a gentle education in the arts of nobility. It was a grueling, often violent, and deeply unpleasant apprenticeship that began when a boy was just a child, as young as 7 years old. We imagine young squires learning swordplay in sunny castle courtyards, being mentored by wise and kindly knights. We picture them learning poetry, music, and the code of chivalry, being molded into perfect gentlemen. This sanitized version of knightly training ignores the harsh reality. It was less of a formal education and more of a brutal boot camp, combined with unpaid servitude. It was designed to toughen boys up by breaking them down first. So let's begin our journey not on the battlefield, but in the castle, where the long, painful, and deeply unglamorous process of creating a knight first began. It was a childhood that most of us today would consider abusive. Let's begin with the most iconic element of the knight, the suit of armor. In our imagination, it is a magnificent work of art, a shining second skin that makes a man invincible. Getting into it seems simple enough in the movies, a process of a few buckles and straps before riding off to glory. The reality, however, was a slow, difficult, and deeply unpleasant ordeal. First, a knight had to put on a padded undergarment called an arming doublet, or gambeson. This thick, quilted jacket was essential to prevent the steel plates from chafing and bruising the skin, but it was also incredibly hot and stuffy. Imagine wearing a thick winter coat indoors. Now imagine wearing it under 60 pounds of metal. This was just the first layer of a personal, portable sauna that the knight would inhabit for hours on end, sweating profusely before he even took a single step towards a fight. Once the padded layer was on, the complex process of arming the knight began. This was not something a knight could do himself. It required the skilled assistance of at least one squire, and sometimes two. It was a meticulous construction project, not a simple act of getting dressed. Each individual piece of the armor, the greaves for the shins, the cuisses for the thighs, the vambraces for the forearms, and so on, had to be attached in a precise order using a complex system of leather straps, buckles, and metal points. A mistake by the squire could be fatal. A strap that was too loose could cause a plate to shift, exposing a vulnerable gap. A strap that was too tight could restrict blood flow or movement at a critical moment. The entire process could take up to an hour of standing, turning, and being fussed over, all while the knight's body temperature steadily rose inside his padded prison. Now, let's talk about the weight. A full suit of 15th century plate armor weighed between 40 and 60 pounds, or roughly 20 to 27 kilograms. While this weight was distributed across the body, it was still a tremendous burden. Every single movement, from walking to lifting an arm, required significantly more effort than normal. The sheer exhaustion was a weapon the armor used against its own wearer. Furthermore, the vision and hearing were severely impaired. The helmet, or helm, had only a narrow slit for vision, called an eye slot. This created a severe case of tunnel vision, making it impossible to see enemies approaching from the side. The sound of battle was muffled and distorted by the steel casing around the knight's head, replaced by the sound of his own panicked, ragged breathing. He was isolated inside his own protective shell, half blind and half deaf to the chaos around him. The armor, designed for protection, came with its own unique and horrifying set of dangers. On a hot day, it became a literal oven, cooking the man inside. Knights could, and did, suffer from heat stroke in the middle of a battle, collapsing from exhaustion and dehydration without ever being touched by an enemy weapon. But perhaps the most terrifying scenario was falling down, particularly in mud or water. If a knight was knocked from his horse and landed on his back, the weight and awkwardness of the armor made it nearly impossible to get up on his own. He was like a beetle flipped onto its shell, helpless and vulnerable. If he fell face first into a puddle or a stream, the weight of the helmet would hold his head under the water, and he could easily drown in just a few inches of water, a slow and ignominious end for a supposedly great warrior. The idea of shining armor? That was a fantasy reserved for parades and ceremonies. On campaign, armor was a constant maintenance nightmare. It would rust. Rain, mud, and even the knight's own sweat were corrosive enemies of the steel. Every night, after a long day of marching or fighting, the armor had to be painstakingly cleaned and oiled by a squire to prevent it from seizing up with rust. The dings and dents from battle had to be hammered out. It was a constant, laborious task. Far from being a pristine symbol of nobility, a knight's field armor was often a dented, rusty, and smelly piece of equipment that required more care than a modern car. It was less a suit of glory and more a high-maintenance cage that you had to live and work in every single day. Before a man could even dream of enduring the misery of wearing armor, he had to survive the brutal process of becoming a knight. This journey began in childhood. Around the age of 7, a boy from a noble family would be sent away from his home to serve as a page in the household of another lord or a powerful relative. This was not a gentle boarding school experience. The primary role of a page was to be a servant. He would run messages, serve food at the high table, help the ladies of the castle with their errands, and learn basic courtly manners. But alongside this, his martial training began, and it was far from glamorous. He learned to ride a horse and was given small wooden swords and shields to practice with, engaging in mock battles with other pages that often ended in real bruises and tears. The life of a page was one of strict discipline and constant work. He was at the bottom of the castle's social ladder, expected to be obedient and silent. Physical punishment was common and considered a necessary part of education. A mistake, whether it was spilling wine at the dinner table or failing to properly care for a lord's hunting dogs, would be met with a swift and painful slap or a beating with a rod. The goal was to instill obedience and toughness, to strip away the softness of childhood and replace it with the hardened discipline required of a future warrior. It was a lonely existence for a young boy, far from his family and forced to navigate a complex and often harsh social environment where he had little to no power or agency. He learned that his own comfort and feelings were secondary to the needs of his lord. If a page proved himself worthy, he would graduate to the rank of squire around the age of 14. This was a significant step up, but it came with even more responsibilities and hardships. The word squire literally means shield bearer, and that was one of his primary duties, to carry his knight's shield and lance. But his job was far more extensive. He was a combination of a personal valet, a bodyguard, an armorer, and a groom. He was responsible for maintaining his knight's weapons and armor, a task we've already seen was laborious and constant. He had to care for his knight's warhorse, an incredibly valuable and powerful animal that required constant attention. He helped his knight get dressed for battle, stood by him during the fight, and helped him if he was wounded or unhorsed. The training of a squire was relentless and intensely physical. His mock battles with wooden swords were replaced with practice using real, albeit blunted, weapons. This was dangerous work. Broken bones, lost teeth, and serious injuries were common. He would practice jousting by charging at a target called a quintain, a rotating dummy with a shield and a weighted arm. If the squire hit the shield incorrectly or too slowly, the arm would swing around and smack him hard, knocking him from his horse. It was a painful and humiliating lesson in speed and accuracy. He spent countless hours in the saddle, mastering the complex movements of mounted combat and building the incredible strength and endurance needed to fight in heavy armor. All of this was done alongside his daily, unending chores of serving his knight. The relationship between a knight and his squire could vary. In the best cases, it was a mentorship, where the knight took a genuine interest in the boy's development. But in many cases, the squire was simply treated as a high-status servant. He would eat his meals after his knight had finished, often getting the leftovers. He would sleep on a simple pallet, at the foot of his knight's bed or outside his door, ready to be called at any moment. During a military campaign, he endured all the same hardships as his knight: the poor food, the bad weather, the constant threat of disease, but with none of the status or potential glory. He was expected to be loyal to the death, to risk his own life to protect his master, all for the hope that one day he might be deemed worthy of becoming a knight himself. Let's transition from the physical hardships to the financial ones. The myth of the knight is that of a wealthy aristocrat. The reality is that being a knight was crushingly expensive, and many knights lived in a state of perpetual financial anxiety. The cost of the basic equipment alone was astronomical. A full suit of high-quality plate armor was not an off-the-shelf item. It was custom-made by a master armorer, a process that could take months. Its cost was equivalent to that of a luxury car or even a small house today. Many knights could not afford a full suit of plate and had to make do with older, less effective mail armor or a mismatched collection of pieces. The idea of every knight being clad in shining, perfectly fitted steel is a complete fabrication. Many looked more like they were wearing second-hand sporting equipment. Even more expensive than the armor was the warhorse, or destrier. These were not ordinary riding horses. They were massive, powerful animals, specially bred and trained for the shock and violence of a cavalry charge. A good warhorse was a finely tuned war machine, and it had a price tag to match. A single destrier could cost more than a small farm. A knight was expected to have several horses, his main warhorse, a lighter horse for travel, and a pack horse for his baggage. The cost of buying, feeding, stabling, and caring for these animals was a constant drain on his resources. If his main warhorse was killed or injured in battle, a very common occurrence, the financial loss was catastrophic. For a poorer knight, losing his horse could mean the end of his career. The expenses didn't stop with the armor and the horse. A knight had to pay for his own weapons, his sword, his lance, his dagger. He also had to support his entourage. This included the salary and upkeep of his squire, and possibly other servants or men-at-arms who followed him. When called to war by his king or lord, a knight was typically expected to serve for a set period, often 40 days, at his own expense. He had to pay for his own food, his own supplies, and the fodder for his horses for the duration of that service. Only after that period was up might he start receiving pay, and even that was not guaranteed. This meant that going to war, the very thing a knight was supposed to do, could bankrupt him before he even saw a battlefield. Because of these immense costs, many knights were constantly scrambling for money. They were land poor, meaning they might have a title and a small manor, but the income from that land was barely enough to cover their knightly obligations. This led to some very unchivalrous behavior. Many knights engaged in what was essentially banditry, extorting money and goods from peasants and merchants traveling through their lands. They would impose illegal tolls on roads and bridges, or simply take what they wanted by force. This was a far cry from the chivalric ideal of protecting the weak. For many knights, survival meant preying on the very people they were supposed to defend. Their noble status was a license for a protection racket. Tournaments are another area where myth and reality diverge sharply. We picture them as festive, honorable sporting events where knights competed for the favor of a lady. While they could be festive, they were anything but safe. Early tournaments were not the structured jousts we see in movies. They were full-scale mock battles, or melees, involving dozens or even hundreds of knights, fighting in teams across a wide area of countryside. The weapons were real, even if sometimes blunted. The goal was to capture opposing knights and hold them for ransom. It was a brutal, chaotic, and incredibly dangerous business. Deaths were frequent, caused by trampling horses, heat stroke inside the armor, or a well-aimed blow that found a weak spot. It was less a sport and more a commercialized form of warfare. For a poor knight, a tournament was a huge gamble. It was one of the few ways he could earn serious money outside of a real war. A successful day at a tournament could mean capturing several wealthy opponents, whose horses, armor, and ransoms could set him up for a year. But the risk was equally high. He could be the one who was captured, losing his own precious horse and armor, and going deep into debt to pay his ransom. Or he could be maimed or killed, ending his career and his life in a single afternoon. Far from being a chivalrous pastime, for many participants, the tournament circuit was a desperate, high-stakes career path, like being a modern-day prizefighter, but with a much higher chance of a fatal workplace accident. Now let's step onto the battlefield. The romantic image is one of two great armies clashing in an open field, with knights engaging in honorable one-on-one duels. The reality was a terrifying, confusing, and disgusting mess. Battles were often fought in mud, which clogged the joints of armor and could suck a knight down if he fell. The air was filled with the screams of wounded men and horses, the deafening clash of steel, and the constant fear of death from any direction. There was very little honor to be found. A knight on his expensive warhorse was a prime target for common soldiers armed with long pikes or polearms, weapons specifically designed to pull a rider from his saddle and finish him on the ground. Once unhorsed, a knight was incredibly vulnerable, easily dispatched by a dagger thrust through a visor or into an armpit. The greatest dangers on a military campaign were often not the enemy's weapons, but the invisible threats of disease and infection. Military camps were crowded, unsanitary places. Tens of thousands of men and animals were packed together with primitive or non-existent sanitation. Human and animal waste contaminated the water supply, leading to devastating outbreaks of diseases like dysentery, which was known as the bloody flux. It was a miserable and dehydrating illness that killed far more soldiers in the Middle Ages than swords or arrows ever did. A knight, for all his armor and training, was just as susceptible to a contaminated sip of water as the lowest peasant foot soldier. He could survive a cavalry charge only to die a slow, agonizing death from disease in a filthy tent. Medical care was rudimentary and often made things worse. If a knight suffered a wound in battle, even a relatively minor one, the risk of infection was enormous. Surgeons had no understanding of germs. Their tools were unsterilized, and they would probe wounds with dirty fingers. The standard treatment for a deep wound was to cauterize it with a red-hot iron, an excruciatingly painful procedure that did little to prevent infection. If a wound did become infected, the likely outcome was a slow death from gangrene or sepsis. The only other option was amputation, performed without anesthetic by a surgeon, using what was essentially a butcher's saw. A knight's chances of surviving such an operation were slim, and even if he did, his career as a warrior was over. What about the famous code of chivalry? This set of ideals, protecting the weak, showing mercy to a defeated foe, fighting fairly, was more of a literary fantasy than a practical guide to conduct. While some knights certainly tried to live up to these ideals, the pressures of war and the realities of human nature meant that the code was often ignored. In the heat of battle, mercy was a luxury few could afford, and the concept of protecting the weak rarely extended to the enemy's civilian population. When an army captured a town or city, it was common practice to sack it, meaning the soldiers were let loose to murder, loot, and terrorize the inhabitants. Knights, as the leaders of these armies, often participated in, or at least permitted these atrocities. The concept of ransom played a huge role in how a knight was treated, and it had nothing to do with honor. A wealthy, high-ranking knight who was captured might be treated relatively well because his captor saw him as a source of income. He would be held until his family could raise the enormous sum for his release. But a poor knight, one with no rich family to pay for him, was a liability. If it was clear no ransom was forthcoming, he might be unceremoniously killed to save his captor the trouble and expense of feeding him. Alternatively, he might be deliberately maimed, perhaps by having a hand or foot cut off and then released, as a brutal message and a warning to others. Chivalry was a fine idea for poets, but on the battlefield, a knight's life was valued in cold, hard cash. Let's delve deeper into the daily discomforts that defined a knight's life. We've talked about the armor, but what about the rest of his existence? The food on campaign was monotonous and often spoiled. The staple was hardtack, a simple, unleavened biscuit, baked until it was rock hard so it wouldn't spoil. It was so hard that soldiers often had to soak it in water or wine just to make it edible, and even then, it was often infested with weevils. The other main source of protein was salted meat, usually pork or beef, preserved in barrels of brine. It was tough, incredibly salty, and not particularly nutritious. Fresh food was a rare luxury. A knight might have slightly better rations than a common soldier, but on a long campaign, everyone suffered from the poor diet, which could lead to health problems like scurvy. Personal hygiene was a concept that was almost entirely absent from a military camp. There were no showers or baths. Knights and soldiers would go for weeks or even months without washing properly. The sweat, grime, and mud would build up on their skin and in their clothes, creating a perfect breeding ground for lice and fleas. The smell in a medieval army camp must have been overwhelming, a potent combination of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, animal and human waste, and cooking fires. Castles weren't much better. While a lord might have a private tub, the sanitation was primitive. Toilets, known as garderobes, were often just a stone chute that emptied into the moat or a cesspit at the base of the castle walls, creating a permanent, foul-smelling hazard. Now, let's consider the psychological toll of being a knight. These men were trained from childhood to be instruments of violence. They witnessed and participated in horrific events on a regular basis. The constant exposure to death and suffering would have a profound impact on anyone's mental health. The modern concept of post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist, but the symptoms surely did. Knights likely suffered from nightmares, anxiety, and fits of rage or melancholy, what the medieval world might have called a humoral imbalance. There was no therapy, no support system. They were expected to be stoic and tough, to suppress any emotional or psychological trauma they experienced. The ideal of the fearless, unflappable warrior was just that, an ideal that concealed a great deal of human suffering. The very structure of a knight's life was one of obligation, not freedom. He was bound by a complex web of loyalties. He swore an oath of fealty to a lord, who in turn swore fealty to a king or a more powerful lord. This meant that a knight could be called away to war at any time, for reasons he might not understand or agree with. A dispute between his lord and a neighbor could mean leaving his home and family to risk his life in a petty squabble over a strip of land. He had very little choice in the matter. Refusing a call to arms would mean breaking his sacred oath, which could result in the loss of his lands and his status. He was a professional warrior, but he was not his own boss. Courtly love is another famous aspect of the knightly myth. The idea of a knight dedicating his deeds to a noble lady, loving her from afar, and being inspired to greatness by her beauty and virtue. This was almost entirely a literary invention, a creation of poets and storytellers. While a knight might publicly declare a lady as his inspiration at a tournament, real-world relationships were governed by much more practical concerns. Marriages among the nobility were not about love. They were business transactions designed to forge alliances, consolidate landholdings, and produce heirs. A knight would marry the woman his family or his lord chose for him, whether he liked her or not. Love was a happy accident, not a requirement. The contrast between the poetic ideal of chivalry and the brutal reality of a knight's work created a strange double standard. A knight could write a poem about the beauty of his lady in the morning, and then lead the sack of a village in the afternoon, participating in acts of extreme violence against women and children. This was not necessarily seen as a contradiction. The rules of chivalry were understood to apply primarily to interactions between nobles. Peasants, commoners, and the enemy's civilian population were often considered outside the protection of this code. This allowed knights to maintain a self-image of nobility and honor while engaging in behavior that we would today consider barbaric. It was a moral flexibility born of a violent and hierarchical world. Let's return to the physical realities of combat. The primary weapon of the knight was the lance, used in a cavalry charge. This was not a weapon of finesse. It was a tool for a single, powerful impact. The goal was to ride at full speed towards a line of enemy soldiers and hope that the combined momentum of horse and rider would shatter their formation. It was an incredibly dangerous and chaotic maneuver. Horses would stumble and fall. Lances would splinter, and the front ranks of both sides would collapse into a writhing mass of men and animals. A knight who successfully delivered a lance strike was then left with a broken shaft, needing to draw his sword and fight in the middle of a chaotic melee. The glorious charge often lasted only a few seconds before descending into a desperate, close-quarters struggle for survival. The sword is the most romanticized weapon of the knight, a symbol of his status and skill. While swords were certainly important, they were a secondary weapon on the battlefield. The real killers of the late Middle Ages were polearms, long-hafted weapons like halberds, bills, and pikes. These weapons, used by disciplined blocks of infantry, were the great equalizer. They could outreach a knight's sword, pull him from his horse, or find a gap in his armor. A wealthy knight in his expensive armor was at a severe disadvantage against a well-organized unit of common foot soldiers who had been trained to work together to bring down mounted warriors. The age of the lone, heroic knight dominating the battlefield was largely over by the 15th century, replaced by the age of disciplined, professional infantry. And what happened to a knight when he grew too old or was too badly injured to fight? There was no pension plan, no retirement fund. If he was lucky, he had a son to inherit his lands and obligations, and he could live out his days on his estate. But if he was a landless knight who had made his living through war and tournaments, his prospects were grim. He might have to take on a role as a garrison commander in some remote, unimportant castle, or serve as a military advisor to a lord. Many former knights, with no other skills, ended their days in poverty, their past glories a distant memory. The violent life they led often left them with chronic pain from old injuries, a constant, physical reminder of a career that had taken a brutal toll on their bodies. The path to becoming a knight was not guaranteed, even for those who endured the brutal training of a page and squire. The final step was the, quote, accolade, the ceremony where a squire was formally dubbed a knight. This could be a grand affair, but often it happened right on the battlefield. A lord might knight a squire for a conspicuous act of bravery in the heat of combat. But it was also a title that could, in some places and times, be bought. A wealthy merchant who wanted the status of a nobleman could sometimes purchase the title of knight for himself or his son, bypassing the traditional martial path entirely. This demonstrated that knighthood was as much about social status and wealth as it was about military prowess. The lines were often blurry. Let's consider the simple act of travel. A knight on the move was not a lone rider on a noble steed. He was the head of a small, slow-moving caravan. He would be accompanied by his squire, other servants, and pack horses carrying his armor, weapons, tents, and other supplies. Travel was slow and dangerous. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks, and bandits were a constant threat. A knight traveling alone or in a small group was a tempting target, not just for his money, but for his valuable horse and equipment. The romantic image of the wandering knight-errant, seeking adventure, ignores the logistical nightmare and constant peril of medieval travel. Every journey was a calculated risk. The legal obligations of a knight were also a heavy burden. As a landholder, a knight often had to act as a judge and administrator for his small estate. He would be responsible for settling disputes between the peasants who lived on his land, collecting taxes and rents, and ensuring the land was productive. These were complex and often thankless tasks that required skills far removed from the battlefield. Many knights were ill-suited to this kind of administrative work, preferring the direct action of combat to the tedious details of estate management. Yet their financial survival depended on it. Failure to manage their lands effectively could lead directly to the poverty we discussed earlier. Even the castle, the supposed symbol of a knight's power and security, was often a cold, dark, and uncomfortable place to live. The iconic stone castles we see today were expensive to build and maintain, and many lesser knights lived in much simpler fortified manor houses. These homes were designed for defense, not comfort. The rooms were often drafty and poorly lit by candles or small, high windows. The air was thick, with smoke from the central hearths, which were the primary source of heat. Privacy was a rare luxury. A lord and his family might have private chambers, but much of the castle's life took place in the Great Hall, a communal space filled with servants, soldiers, and guests. It was a life lived largely in public. The boredom of a knight's life is something rarely considered. While our stories focus on the exciting moments of battle and tournament, these were the exceptions, not the rule. Much of a knight's time, especially during periods of peace, was spent waiting for a call to war, waiting for a tournament, or simply waiting out the long, cold winter months inside a drafty castle. They would pass the time with hunting, a popular and practical pastime that honed their riding and combat skills. They would practice their weapons training, play chess, or listen to traveling minstrels. But for a man trained for action and violence, long periods of inactivity could be a psychological challenge in itself. The relationship between knights and the church was complex. On one hand, the church promoted the idea of the Christian knight, a warrior who fought for God and defended the faith. The Crusades were the ultimate expression of this ideal, framing the knight's violent skills as a tool for a holy purpose. Knights took religious oaths and participated in services. On the other hand, the church often condemned the violence and greed of the knightly class, particularly the brutal tournaments and the exploitation of the peasantry. Knights were caught in a strange position, simultaneously celebrated as defenders of the faith and condemned as violent sinners in need of repentance. This moral ambiguity was a central part of their identity. Let's talk more about the horse. A knight's bond with his warhorse was incredibly important, but it was a professional relationship, not a sentimental one. The destrier was a tool of war, and it was trained to be aggressive. These horses were taught to bite, kick, and trample infantry soldiers. They were powerful and often difficult to control, requiring a rider with immense skill and strength. In the chaos of battle, a warhorse could be just as dangerous to its allies as to its enemies if it panicked. And the emotional impact on a knight of seeing his trusted mount, his partner in battle, and his most valuable asset suffer a gruesome injury must have been profound. Yet it was a reality he had to be prepared for every time he rode into a fight. The very notion of honor was a slippery concept. A knight's primary duty was loyalty to his lord. But what if his lord commanded him to do something dishonorable, like attack a church or murder unarmed prisoners? This created a conflict of loyalties. Was it more honorable to obey your lord, to whom you had sworn a sacred oath, or to follow the more abstract moral code of chivalry? In most cases, the oath to the lord won out. A knight's survival and social standing depended on the favor of his master, not on the opinions of poets. This practical reality meant that knights often found themselves participating in acts that directly contradicted the noble ideals they were supposed to embody. Let's consider the end of the knightly era. The rise of new technologies and tactics slowly made the traditional, heavily armored knight obsolete on the battlefield. The English longbow, with its ability to pierce all but the thickest plate armor from a distance, was a major factor. Disciplined formations of Swiss pikemen proved they could defeat a cavalry charge. And finally, the introduction of gunpowder and firearms rendered plate armor almost useless. A knight's expensive, custom-made suit of steel, the product of a lifetime of training and a fortune in wealth, could be defeated by a common man with a simple handgun and a few moments of training. It was the end of an era, a slow, painful decline in relevance. So when we pull back and look at the complete picture, the romantic myth of the knight completely falls apart. Instead of a life of adventure and glory, we see a life of constant physical discomfort, from the heat of the armor to the cold of the castle. We see a life of crushing financial pressure, where the tools of the trade could bankrupt a man. We see a career defined by brutal violence, horrifying injuries, and the constant threat of disease. It was a life that began with a harsh childhood and often ended in a painful, impoverished old age. The shining knight of legend was a beautiful lie, created to cover up a much uglier, messier, and more human truth. The reality is, it truly sucked to be a knight. Let's return to the physical sensations of being a knight, specifically the noise. The world of a knight in armor was not a quiet one. Imagine the constant soundtrack of your own life being the clanking and scraping of metal on metal. Every step you took was accompanied by a chorus of squeaks from leather straps and the dull ring of steel plates shifting against each other. In battle, this personal soundtrack was drowned out by a terrifying symphony of external noise. The thunder of thousands of hooves, the splintering crash of lances, the percussive clang of sword against shield, and the constant, gut-wrenching screams of men and horses in agony. The modern idea of a stoic, silent warrior is absurd. A battlefield was one of the loudest places on Earth, a sensory overload designed to induce panic and terror, and the knight was right in the middle of it. Let's examine the squire's role on the battlefield more closely, because it reveals so much about the knightly reality. The squire was not just a passive observer. He was an active participant in his knight's survival. He would follow his master into the fray, riding a lesser horse and carrying spare weapons. If the knight's lance shattered, the squire had to be ready to hand him his sword or battle axe. If the knight was unhorsed, it was the squire's terrifying job to rush to his side, help him to his feet, and protect him from being swarmed by enemy foot soldiers. This meant a teenage boy, often with little to no armor himself, was expected to charge into the most dangerous part of the battlefield to aid his master. The casualty rate for squires must have been appallingly high, an unglamorous and often unrecorded sacrifice. We often think of medieval warfare in terms of great, decisive battles. In reality, much of a knight's military career was spent not in open battle, but in the grueling and tedious business of siege warfare. This involved surrounding an enemy castle or town and trying to starve the inhabitants out or find a way to breach the walls. This could be a months-long affair. For the knight in the besieging army, it meant living in a sprawling, unsanitary camp, enduring boredom, poor rations, and the constant threat of disease. The action consisted of digging trenches, building siege engines like trebuchets and battering rams, and occasionally participating in a bloody and often suicidal assault on the walls. It was slow, miserable, and deeply unheroic work, more akin to being a manual laborer than a glorious warrior. And if a knight was on the defending side of a siege, his situation was arguably even worse. He was trapped inside the walls with a dwindling supply of food and water. As the siege dragged on, the defenders would be forced to eat their own horses, then their dogs, and eventually, in the most desperate cases, rats and boiled leather. The water supply would become contaminated, and disease would run rampant through the crowded, starving population. The knight would have to watch as the civilians and even his own soldiers grew weaker and weaker, all while the enemy outside bombarded the walls day and night. The psychological pressure was immense. Surrender meant capture and ransom, but holding out for too long could mean a brutal end for everyone inside if the walls were finally breached by an enraged and merciless enemy. The chivalric concept of a fair fight is almost entirely a modern invention, projected back onto the past. Medieval warfare was about winning by any means necessary. Ambushes, surprise attacks, and targeting an enemy's supplies were all standard and effective tactics. A knight leading a small patrol could easily find himself the victim of a sudden attack from a hidden enemy force. There was no challenge issued, no honorable duel. There was only the sudden chaos of an ambush, the frantic struggle for survival, and the high probability of being cut down before you even had a chance to properly draw your sword. The idea of looking your opponent in the eye before engaging was a luxury that the brutal realities of war rarely afforded. Deception and surprise were far more valuable weapons than any sense of fair play. Let's reconsider the financial aspect from another angle: the pressure to maintain appearances. A knight was a member of the nobility, and he was expected to look the part. This meant that even if he was poor, he had to spend money he didn't have on things like fine clothes for courtly occasions, a colorful banner with his coat of arms, and decorated tack for his horse. This conspicuous consumption was a vital part of maintaining his status. To appear poor was to lose respect and influence. This created a terrible cycle for a struggling knight. He had to spend money to maintain the image of wealth, which in turn drove him deeper into poverty. It was a life of faking it until you make it, except many of them never made it, and were simply crushed under the weight of their social and financial obligations. The concept of individual glory, so central to the knightly myth, was often at odds with the needs of the army. A knight, eager to prove his bravery and capture a wealthy opponent for ransom, might be tempted to break formation and charge at the enemy on his own. While this might occasionally work, it was usually a disastrous tactic. A lone knight was an easy target. By breaking formation, he not only endangered himself, but also created a weakness in his own army's line that the enemy could exploit. Military commanders constantly struggled to impose discipline on their noble-born knights, who often saw themselves as individual heroes rather than members of a cohesive military unit. Their pride and thirst for personal glory could be a greater threat to their own side than the enemy was. Let's talk about the weather. We often imagine medieval scenes playing out on sunny days in pleasant green fields. But a knight on campaign was completely at the mercy of the elements, and his armor made everything worse. In the rain, his padded undergarments would become soaked and heavy, and water would seep through the joints of his armor. Rust would begin to form almost immediately. In the cold, the steel plates of his armor would become intensely cold, chilling him to the bone and making his muscles stiff and slow to react. A knight could suffer from frostbite or hypothermia just as easily as a common soldier. The armor offered no real insulation, only a heavy, metallic shell that seemed to amplify the misery of whatever the weather was doing, whether it was baking him in the sun or freezing him in the sleet. The legal system, as it applied to knights, could be brutal and strange. For a time, a practice known as, quote, trial by combat was a recognized way of settling legal disputes. If two nobles had a disagreement over land or an accusation of treason, they could be ordered to fight a duel to the death. The belief was that God would grant victory to the man who was in the right. This meant a knight's life and property could depend not on evidence or justice, but on his skill with a sword or lance on one particular day. It was a high-stakes, violent form of litigation, where a moment of bad luck or a slip in the mud could mean not only losing your case, but losing your life. It was a terrifying fusion of law and violence. What about peacetime injuries? A knight's life was intensely physical, even when he wasn't at war. Hunting, a favorite pastime, was fraught with danger. A fall from a horse or an attack from a wounded, cornered animal, like a wild boar, could result in serious or fatal injuries. Even the endless hours of weapons training carried risks. A mistake during a practice joust or a sparring session with live steel could lead to a broken bone, a deep cut, or a concussion. These injuries, combined with the primitive medical care available, meant that a knight's body was in a constant state of accumulating damage. The image of the graceful, athletic warrior hides the reality of a man likely suffering from chronic pain, old fractures that never healed properly, and a network of scars. The social pressure within the knightly class was immense. It was a competitive and often ruthless world. A knight's reputation, or honor, was his most valuable currency, and it had to be defended at all costs. A perceived insult, no matter how slight, could be grounds for a duel. This created a culture of hyper-masculinity and aggression, where any sign of weakness or hesitation could lead to a loss of face. Knights were constantly jockeying for position, for the favor of their lord, for a more prominent place in the battle line, or for a more advantageous marriage. It was a stressful, high-pressure social environment where a wrong word could be as dangerous as a wrong move in battle. Let's consider the simple act of eating and drinking inside the armor. During a long battle or a period of waiting on the field, a knight couldn't simply take off his helmet to have a drink of water or a bite of food. Removing the helmet made him incredibly vulnerable. Some later helmets incorporated hinged visors that could be lifted, but even this was risky. More often, a squire would have to pass his knight a drink, and the knight would have to awkwardly tilt his head back and try to pour the liquid through the breathing holes or eye slit of his helm, with much of it likely spilling down the front of his armor. It was a clumsy, frustrating process that highlighted how the armor, meant to protect, also trapped and inconvenienced its wearer in the most basic ways. The world a knight lived in was also a world steeped in superstition. People believed in curses, omens, and the power of magic. A knight heading into battle might carry a lucky charm or a religious relic, believing it offered supernatural protection. A string of bad luck, a horse going lame, a weapon breaking, might be interpreted not as a random occurrence, but as a sign that God was displeased or that an enemy had placed a curse on him. This added another layer of psychological stress to an already terrifying profession. A knight was not just fighting against men. In his mind, he might also be fighting against unseen, malevolent forces that were conspiring against him. This worldview would have made the random chaos of battle seem even more frightening and personal. Let's talk about the horses again, but from a different perspective: their vulnerability. A knight's warhorse was a huge and intimidating target, and enemy soldiers knew that unhorsing a knight was the most effective way to defeat him. They would use specialized weapons like bills and halberds to hamstring the horses, cutting their leg tendons and bringing them crashing to the ground. It was a brutal but effective tactic. For the knight, the experience of having his horse collapse underneath him in the middle of a battle would have been terrifying. He would be thrown to the ground with 60 pounds of armor on, dazed and disoriented, while his trusted mount, an animal he had spent a fortune on, lay screaming in agony beside him. It was a tactical, financial, and emotional catastrophe all in one. The very landscape a knight fought in was an enemy. We think of medieval Europe as a place of forests and fields, but it was also a land of marshes, bogs, and thick, impassable woods. Armies, especially heavily armored cavalry, were often restricted to a few poor-quality roads. A commander who made a mistake and led his knights into marshy ground was courting disaster. Horses would become bogged down in the mud, and knights who fell or were unhorsed could easily drown in the mire, weighed down by their armor. The famous Battle of Agincourt was a prime example, where French knights charged across a muddy field and were exhausted and disordered before they even reached the English lines, making them easy targets for archers. The terrain itself could defeat an army before the fighting even began. The booty or loot from a battle was a major motivation for many knights, especially the poorer ones. The chivalric ideal of fighting for honor was often secondary to the very practical goal of capturing wealth. After a victory, the battlefield would be stripped of anything valuable. Knights and soldiers would take the armor, weapons, and money from the dead and the captured. This was a grim and bloody business. The wounded from the losing side were often killed rather than cared for, both to put them out of their misery and so their equipment could be taken more easily. It was a ruthless process that turned a battlefield into a marketplace, where a knight's success was measured by the material wealth he could strip from the bodies of his fallen enemies. The role of a knight in law enforcement is another unglamorous reality. In the absence of a formal police force, lords often used their knights to enforce their will. This could involve hunting down criminals, but it also often meant putting down peasant revolts. When overtaxed and desperate peasants rose up against their masters, it was the knights who were sent in to crush the rebellion. This was not a battle against an equal foe. It was the brutal suppression of poorly armed and untrained commoners. The knights, with their superior armor, weapons, and training, would inflict terrible casualties. This role as the violent enforcer of a brutal and unequal social order is a far cry from the myth of the knight as the protector of the common people. Let's consider the concept of lineage and family pressure. A knight born into a famous and powerful family carried a heavy burden of expectation on his shoulders. He was expected to live up to the glorious deeds of his father and grandfather. This created immense pressure to be brave, to be successful in battle, and to never show fear. A moment of cowardice or a failure in a tournament would not just be a personal disgrace, it would be a stain on the honor of his entire family. This constant need to prove his worth, to live up to a heroic legacy, must have been an exhausting and anxiety-inducing part of his existence, turning every public act into a test of his character. The diet of a knight, even in peacetime within a castle, was not as varied or pleasant as we might imagine. While a lord's high table would feature impressive dishes, the foundation of the diet was bread and meat. Vegetables were often viewed with suspicion or considered peasant food. The flavors were strong and heavily spiced, not for sophisticated palates, but to disguise the taste of meat that was beginning to spoil. Without refrigeration, keeping food fresh was a constant struggle. The heavy, meat-rich diet, combined with a great deal of wine and ale, likely led to a host of health problems, from obesity to gout, a painful inflammatory arthritis associated with a rich diet. The feasting knight was likely also a rather unhealthy one. In the end, the most profound thing that sucked about being a knight was the complete and utter lack of personal freedom. From the moment he was sent away as a page at age 7, his life was not his own. It was dictated by the needs of his family, the commands of his lord, and the rigid social code of his class. He was a cog in the great feudal machine, a tool of war and social control. The romantic image of the knight-errant, a free agent riding through the world righting wrongs, was the ultimate fantasy because it represented the one thing a real knight could never truly have: the ability to choose his own path. His life was one of brutal obligation from beginning to end. Let's dive deeper into the reality of a battlefield after the fighting was over. The victors, including the knights, would walk among the dead and dying. Their primary task was not to render aid, but to conduct a grim accounting. They would identify the enemy dead, looking for high-ranking nobles by the coats of arms on their shields or tunics. A dead noble was a disappointment. A captured one was a potential fortune. The wounded were a problem. A grievously wounded enemy knight might be given a mercy stroke, a quick death with a dagger, not out of compassion, but because it was practical. It was a cold, brutal calculus that had nothing to do with chivalry, and everything to do with profit and loss. The field was not a place of honor, but an open-air abattoir and auction house. Consider the act of paying ransom. If a knight was captured, a message would be sent to his family, stating the price for his life. This could be a ruinous sum, often demanding years of income from his estate. His family would have to scramble to raise the cash, perhaps by selling land, borrowing from moneylenders at exorbitant interest rates, or even melting down family silver. While they did this, the captured knight would be held prisoner. His treatment would depend entirely on his captor. He might be kept in reasonable comfort, but he could just as easily be thrown into a dark, filthy dungeon and given minimal food as a way to pressure his family into paying more quickly. The entire experience, from capture to release, was a prolonged period of terror, uncertainty, and financial devastation. We should also talk about the simple, mundane pain that was a knight's constant companion, not the acute pain of a battle wound, but the chronic, grinding pain of daily life. The armor caused chafing, sores, and bruises. The constant riding led to saddle sores and back problems. The heavy, repetitive weapons training put immense strain on joints, leading to the medieval equivalent of tennis elbow or rotator cuff injuries. These were not considered serious injuries, just the normal aches and pains of the job. There were no painkillers, no physical therapy. A knight was just expected to endure it, to live with a baseline of physical discomfort that would be considered debilitating by modern standards. It was a life lived in a body that was always, to some degree, in pain. Let's explore the psychological impact of the first kill. For a young knight or squire in his first battle, the act of killing another human being, up close and personal, must have been a profoundly traumatic event. All his training was geared towards this moment, but the reality of plunging a sword into another person, of feeling the life drain from them, is something no amount of practice can truly prepare you for. The stories and poems celebrated these acts as heroic, but the visceral reality would have been horrifying. This moment, the crossing of a profound moral and psychological boundary, would have changed a young man forever, either hardening him to the violence or leaving him with deep, unspoken psychological scars that he would have to carry for the rest of his violent career. The social life in a castle was not just about feasting and music. It was a hotbed of intrigue, gossip, and rivalry. A knight had to be a politician as well as a warrior. He had to navigate the complex relationships between the lord, his lady, their children, and other knights and guests. A careless word, a perceived slight, or an ill-advised flirtation could have serious consequences. Falling out of favor with the lord or lady could mean losing your position, your lands, or even your life. A knight had to be constantly vigilant, watching what he said and did, always aware of the shifting alliances and hidden resentments that swirled around him. The court was in many ways as dangerous as the battlefield, just with different weapons. Let's think about the winter. Military campaigns usually ceased during the winter months, as the weather made travel and foraging for food nearly impossible. For a knight, this meant a long period of forced inactivity, cooped up inside a cold, drafty castle. The days were short and dark. The entertainment was limited. It was a time of profound boredom. This enforced idleness could be a psychological challenge for men conditioned for action. Fights and arguments would break out over trivial matters. The heavy drinking that was common in medieval culture would only exacerbate these tensions. The long, dark winter was something to be endured, a test of patience that was a very different, but still significant hardship of knightly life. The very concept of justice for a knight was tied to his social status. If a knight committed a crime against a peasant, stole from him, beat him, or worse, he was very unlikely to face any serious consequences. The word of a noble almost always carried more weight than the word of a commoner. The local court was likely presided over by the knight's own lord, who would be inclined to protect his own man. However, if a knight committed a crime against another noble, or against the interests of his lord, the punishment could be swift and severe. This created a legal system where a knight could act with near impunity towards those below him, but was himself vulnerable to the whims and judgments of those above him. It was a system of privilege, not of justice. The communication system of the medieval world added another layer of stress. When a knight went off to war, he was completely cut off from his home and family. It might be months or even years before they received any news of him. They would not know if he was alive, wounded, or captured. Similarly, he would have no news from home. He would not know if his wife and children were safe, if his lands were secure, or if his estate was facing a crisis. This lack of information created a constant state of anxiety for both the knight and his family. The romantic farewell scenes in movies ignore the grim reality that for many, that farewell would be the very last time they ever saw each other, and the ones left behind would spend years simply not knowing. Let's circle back to the armor's many flaws. One aspect we haven't touched on is its vulnerability to certain types of attack. While plate armor was excellent at deflecting a sword cut, it was susceptible to crushing, concussive blows from weapons like maces and warhammers. A strong blow from a mace wouldn't break the armor, but it would transfer a tremendous amount of kinetic energy through it, breaking the bones and rupturing the organs of the man inside. A knight could die from massive internal injuries without a single drop of his blood being spilled. This is why blunt force weapons became so popular in the later Middle Ages. They were a direct answer to the problem of plate armor, turning a knight's protective shell into a cage where he could be beaten to death. Finally, let's consider the legacy of the knight. The reason the myth of the shining hero is so powerful is because it was deliberately created. The noble class itself promoted the stories, poems, and songs that glorified their role. It was a form of propaganda designed to justify their privileged and violent position at the top of the social hierarchy. They painted themselves as honorable protectors and chivalrous heroes because it was a much better story than the reality of being brutal enforcers for a deeply unequal system. The myth of the knight is a testament to the power of good marketing. It's a story so compelling that it has almost completely erased the miserable, violent, and uncomfortable truth of what it really meant to be a knight in the Middle Ages. Let's examine the role of heraldry. The colorful coat of arms on a knight's shield and banner seems like a romantic detail, but it served a very practical and dangerous purpose. On a chaotic battlefield where everyone was wearing face-concealing helmets, heraldry was the only way to tell friend from foe, and, more importantly, to identify high-value targets. A knight displaying the arms of a rich and powerful duke was like a walking bullseye. Enemy knights would actively seek him out, not necessarily to kill him, but to capture him, knowing his ransom would be enormous. The very symbol of a knight's noble identity was also a beacon that attracted the most intense and dangerous kind of attention on the battlefield. It was a mark of both pride and peril. The logistics of a military campaign were a knight's constant headache. An army, as they say, marches on its stomach. This meant a vast and slow-moving baggage train had to follow the soldiers, carrying not just food, but also blacksmithing equipment for repairing armor and shoeing horses, tents, medical supplies, and more. This baggage train was extremely vulnerable to attack. A successful raid on an army's supplies could cripple it more effectively than a pitched battle. A knight, especially if he was a commander, had to constantly worry about protecting these supply lines. It was a stressful and unglamorous aspect of warfare, a game of logistics that was just as important as the fighting itself, but which is completely absent from the heroic tales. Let's talk about the horse's diet. We've discussed the cost of a war horse, but feeding it on campaign was another massive challenge. A large horse performing strenuous activity needs a huge amount of fodder, mainly oats and hay, every single day. An army with thousands of horses needed to transport and distribute literally tons of fodder. When supplies ran low, knights had to send out foraging parties to seize grain and hay from the local countryside. These foraging missions were dangerous, often leading to skirmishes with local militias or enemy patrols. And if fodder couldn't be found, the horses would weaken, becoming less effective in battle and more susceptible to disease. The health of a knight's mount was a constant source of worry and a major logistical burden. The concept of knight-errant, the wandering knight seeking adventure, has a grain of truth, but it's a dark one. After major wars, thousands of trained, armed, and unemployed soldiers, including many landless knights, would be let loose upon the countryside. They formed mercenary groups known as free companies. They were not noble adventurers, they were essentially organized gangs of thugs who roamed the land, terrorizing communities and selling their violent services to the highest bidder. They would capture a town and demand a huge payment to leave it unmolested. This was the grim reality behind the fantasy of the wandering knight. For the common person, seeing a group of armed knights approaching was not a sign of salvation, but a sign of impending disaster. Consider the sheer claustrophobia of the helmet. A great helm, a common type in the earlier medieval period, was essentially a steel bucket placed over the head. It rested on the shoulders and wasn't attached to the armor below. The knight's head could turn inside the helm, but the helm itself stayed facing forward. To see to the side, he had to turn his entire upper body. The air inside would quickly become hot, stale, and filled with the smell of his own sweat and fear. The feeling of being trapped, of being unable to breathe fresh air or see clearly, especially amidst the terror of battle, must have been overwhelming. Many knights probably felt a wave of panic the moment they lowered their helm into place, a feeling they had to suppress to function. The relationship between knights and archers was one of mutual hatred. Knights, as the aristocratic elite, looked down on archers as low-born commoners, yet they also feared them intensely. A volley of arrows from a unit of English longbowmen could kill and maim knights and their horses from hundreds of yards away, before the knights even had a chance to fight. There was nothing chivalrous about it. From the knight's perspective, it was a cowardly way to fight, but it was incredibly effective. This led to a grim practice. Knights would often give no quarter to captured archers, executing them on the spot rather than holding them for ransom, as a way of punishing them for their battlefield effectiveness and their perceived lack of honor. Let's talk about the specific danger of crossbows. While the longbow required immense strength and years of practice, the crossbow was a simpler weapon to use. It could be loaded and held ready, and its bolts could be fired with tremendous power, capable of punching through most mail and even some plate armor at close range. The church even tried to ban the use of crossbows against Christians, viewing it as a terrifyingly and unfairly lethal weapon. For a knight, the crossbow was another source of anonymous death from a distance. The man who killed him might be a common mercenary hidden behind a wall, someone he never even saw. This undermined the entire knightly ethos of personal, face-to-face combat. The physical act of jousting was incredibly violent. The goal was to strike the opponent with a long, wooden lance, while both riders were charging at each other at a combined speed of maybe 40 miles per hour. The impact was immense. Lances were designed to splinter to absorb some of the force, but the shock to the body was still brutal. A solid hit could easily break bones or cause a severe concussion, even if it didn't unhorse the rider. And being unhorsed was a violent event in itself. Being thrown from a moving horse while wearing heavy armor and then crashing to the ground often resulted in serious injury. The festive crowds and colorful pageantry of the tournament masked the fact that the competitors were engaging in an activity with a level of physical violence comparable to a modern car crash. The religious fervor of the Crusades added a unique and terrible dimension to the knights' experience. When knights went to the Holy Land, they were not just fighting for a lord. They were told they were fighting for God. This belief was used to justify acts of extreme brutality. When the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, for example, they massacred the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, men, women, and children, in a horrific slaughter that lasted for days. A knight participating in this was told that by killing infidels, he was actually washing away his own sins. It was a holy war, which meant the normal restraints on violence, as limited as they were, did not apply. This fusion of faith and bloodshed created some of the most appalling atrocities of the entire medieval period. So as we draw this exploration to a close, let's reflect on the image we started with, the knight in shining armor. We can now see that the armor was not shining. It was a rusty, dented, and heavy prison. The knight was not a dashing hero. He was an often poor, stressed, and uncomfortable professional soldier in a brutal line of work. His life was not one of adventure, but one of endless obligation, discomfort, and the constant, looming threat of a violent death or financial ruin. The myth is a beautiful story, but the reality was a hard, smelly, and painful existence. The next time you picture a knight, perhaps don't picture the glory. Picture the man inside the can, sweating, exhausted, and probably wishing he had chosen a much easier job. Let's delve into the specific social awkwardness of armor. Imagine a knight being required to attend a formal feast or council meeting while on campaign. He might not have the time or security to fully disarm. This meant he could be sitting at a table, trying to eat and drink, while encased in at least parts of his steel shell. Trying to maneuver in a crowded room, sitting on a bench, or even just having a conversation was made incredibly clumsy by the armor. The clanking, the restricted movement, and the sheer bulk of a man in armor would have made him a hazard in any indoor space. The image of knights smoothly navigating a royal court in full plate is a fantasy. The reality would have been more like a bulldozer trying to navigate a tea party. Consider the concept of losing face. For a knight, public perception was everything. A moment of hesitation in battle, a poor performance in a tournament, or even being outsmarted in a courtly debate could lead to a loss of reputation. This constant performance anxiety was a huge psychological burden. He was always on display, his every action judged by his peers, his lord, and his rivals. This is partly why the code of chivalry, even if often ignored in practice, was so important in theory. It provided the script for how a knight was supposed to act. Adhering to this script, at least in public, was crucial for maintaining the illusion of effortless nobility and honor, an illusion that was vital to his social survival. The idea of a quest is central to the knightly myth. In stories, a knight is sent on a noble mission by a king or a beautiful princess. In reality, a knight's quests were far more mundane and brutal. He might be sent to collect overdue taxes from a stubborn village, a task that could easily turn violent. He might be ordered to track down and capture a political rival of his lord. Or he might be tasked with policing a stretch of forest, which really meant driving out anyone his lord didn't want there. These were not the heroic adventures of legend. They were the grim, dirty work of enforcing a feudal lord's power, and they rarely involved slaying dragons or rescuing damsels in distress. Let's talk about the dental health of a knight. It was, in a word, atrocious. Diets heavy in coarse bread and sugar, a luxury for the rich, combined with a complete lack of dental hygiene, meant that tooth decay, gum disease, and tooth loss were rampant. A knight might have a fearsome reputation on the battlefield, but up close, he likely had broken, missing, or blackened teeth and terrible breath. A toothache, a common ailment, could be debilitating. The only cure was extraction, performed without anesthetic by a barber surgeon using a terrifying pair of pliers. The pain and risk of infection from such a procedure were immense. The handsome, smiling knight of the movies is a stark contrast to the likely reality of a man suffering from chronic dental pain. The Vow of the Peacock is a perfect example of the extreme and often absurd nature of chivalric performance. In some courts, a knight would make a solemn oath over a roasted peacock, promising to perform some incredible feat of arms. These vows were made publicly, and were often wildly impractical, like being the first to strike the enemy's banner or refusing to retreat under any circumstances. While this was meant to demonstrate incredible bravery, it was also a recipe for disaster. A knight bound by such a foolish vow could endanger himself and his comrades by making reckless tactical decisions. It shows how the performance of chivalry could become a bizarre and dangerous competition, prioritizing theatrical bravado over common sense and survival. Let's revisit the financial burden from the perspective of inheritance. In many parts of Europe, the system of primogeniture was in place. This meant that the eldest son inherited the entirety of his father's lands and titles. This was great for the eldest son, but terrible for his younger brothers. A younger son of a noble family would inherit no land and no title. He would have his noble birth and his military training, but no estate to support him. This created a whole class of landless, desperate knights. Their only career options were to enter the church, marry a wealthy heiress, a rare prize, or become a mercenary, selling his sword to whoever would pay. Many of the most ruthless and violent knights were these younger sons, fighting for their very survival. The noise inside a helmet during combat deserves its own focus. It wasn't just his own breathing the knight heard. Every blow that struck his helmet, even a glancing one, would have been deafeningly loud, like having someone ring a giant church bell right next to your ear. The vibration would travel through the steel and into his skull. A strong blow could leave him dazed, disoriented, and with his ears ringing for hours, even if the helmet wasn't breached. The cumulative effect of these blows over the course of a battle would have been concussive. Many knights probably ended a fight with a splitting headache and a temporary loss of hearing, a state of sensory trauma that made them vulnerable in the aftermath of the main engagement. Let's consider the specific misery of fighting in the mud. The Battle of Agincourt is the most famous example, but it was a common problem. When heavily armored men and horses tried to move through thick, sticky mud, they expended a huge amount of energy. Each step was a struggle. If a knight fell, the mud would work its way into the joints of his armor, making it even harder to move. He could become literally stuck. Furthermore, the ground would be churned into a gruesome soup of mud, water, blood, and viscera. The simple act of breathing would mean inhaling the foul stench of this battlefield quagmire. It was a multisensory nightmare that exhausted and demoralized soldiers long before they properly engaged the enemy. What about the moral injury of a knight's work? We've talked about PTSD, but moral injury is different. It's the damage done to one's conscience by performing, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that transgress one's own moral beliefs. A knight, raised on stories of honor and piety, who then found himself participating in the massacre of civilians or the execution of prisoners, would have had to reconcile these actions with his self-image. This could lead to deep feelings of guilt, shame, and cynicism. He might become hardened and cruel, or he might be haunted by the things he had seen and done. This internal spiritual wound is an invisible but profound part of why it sucked to be a knight. The role of women in a knight's life was far from the poetic ideal. A noble lady was a political and economic asset. Her marriage was a tool for her family to create alliances. Once married, her primary duty was to produce a male heir to continue the lineage. Her life was largely confined to the domestic sphere of the castle, managing the household, a complex and demanding job in itself. She had little agency over her own life choices. The courtly love poems, where she was placed on a pedestal, were a fantasy that masked a reality where she was essentially a valuable piece of property, passed from her father's control to her husband's. Her power was indirect, exercised through influence and persuasion within a system that gave her no formal authority. Let's talk about the specific danger of fire as a weapon. In siege warfare, attackers would often launch flaming projectiles over the castle walls using trebuchets or catapults. These could set the wooden buildings inside the castle bailey on fire, creating panic and chaos. For a knight defending the walls, fire was a terrifying threat. A splash of burning pitch or oil could stick to his armor, and the intense heat could cook him inside his own suit. There was also the psychological terror of being trapped in a burning castle, a situation that could turn the ultimate defensive structure into a deadly fire trap. Fire was a weapon that bypassed armor and turned a knight's greatest strength into his greatest vulnerability. The life of a knight was one of profound contrasts. He was a member of the elite, yet often desperately poor. He was celebrated in poetry as a gentle protector, yet his job was to be a ruthless killer. He lived in a fortified castle for security, yet that castle could become a diseased, starving prison during a siege. He was bound by a code of honor, yet was often required to perform dishonorable acts by his lord. This constant state of contradiction, of living between a glorious ideal and a brutal reality, must have been a source of deep psychological tension. It was a life that demanded a man be two completely different people at the same time, a feat that is difficult, if not impossible, to sustain. Consider the simple act of going to the toilet while on the march. An army did not have portable latrines. Soldiers, including knights, would simply relieve themselves in designated latrine fields or on the side of the road. This practice, repeated by thousands of men over several days, created a massive sanitation problem. It fouled the local environment, contaminated water sources, and contributed to the rapid spread of disease. For the knight himself, the lack of privacy and the generally disgusting conditions were just another daily indignity, a far cry from the noble image of the hero on his white horse. It was a constant reminder of the crude, unhygienic reality of his world. Let's look at the career trajectory of a successful knight. If he survived the battles, the diseases, and the tournaments, and managed his finances well, he might end up as a powerful lord. But this success brought new problems. He was now a major political player, responsible for managing vast lands, commanding other knights, and engaging in the dangerous game of high-level politics. He had more to lose. A single political miscalculation, backing the wrong side in a civil war, could lead to his downfall, the loss of all his lands, and even his execution for treason. In the world of the nobility, the higher you climbed, the further you had to fall. The pressures and dangers simply changed their form. They never went away. The food poisoning risk was ever present. Without refrigeration, meat and other perishable foods would spoil quickly, especially in the summer. While heavy salting and smoking could preserve meat, these processes weren't always perfect. A knight at a feast, eating a wide variety of dishes, had a good chance of consuming something that was contaminated with bacteria. A case of food poisoning could be debilitating, causing severe vomiting and diarrhea. In an era before antibiotics and intravenous fluids, a bad case could easily be fatal due to dehydration. The grand feast, a symbol of wealth and power, was also a potential biological minefield. Let's examine the glory of single combat. In stories, knights often seek out and challenge their equals on the enemy side to honorable duels. While this did happen on rare occasions, it was not the norm. A smart commander would forbid his knights from engaging in such risky, individualistic behavior. Furthermore, a smart knight would know that the honorable approach was often the stupidest one. Why challenge a heavily armored enemy knight to a difficult sword fight when you could have a few of your archers shoot him from a distance, or have a group of your men-at-arms pull him off his horse and swarm him? War is about efficiency, and the most efficient way to deal with an enemy is rarely the most chivalrous. The horses were not just tools, they were also victims. The brutal training of a war horse involved desensitizing it to the noise and chaos of battle. They were trained to be aggressive and to endure injury. In battle, they suffered horrific wounds from arrows, pikes, and swords. A knight's love for his horse was often secondary to the needs of war. If a horse was wounded but could still walk, it might be forced to carry on. The sheer scale of equine suffering in medieval warfare is a hidden tragedy. For every knight who died in battle, several horses likely died as well, their suffering and sacrifice largely unrecorded by the chroniclers who focused on the deeds of their noble masters. Let's consider the fate of a knight's family if he was killed. If he had a male heir who was old enough, the son would inherit the lands and the title. But if his children were young, the lord could take control of the estate, acting as the children's guardian. This often meant the lord would plunder the estate's resources for his own benefit. The widow might be forced into a new marriage with a man of her lord's choosing to ensure the land remained under his control. The death of a knight did not just create emotional grief, it triggered a financial and political crisis for his family, who were often left vulnerable to the ambitions and greed of their superiors. The very air a knight breathed in a castle was likely unhealthy. The combination of smoke from open fires, a lack of ventilation, and the general grime and dampness would have created poor air quality. Respiratory illnesses were likely common. Furthermore, the rushes or straw that often covered the floors were a perfect breeding ground for pests. They were rarely changed and would accumulate spilled food, animal droppings, and other filth over months. The castle, which appears so strong and romantic from the outside, was on the inside often a dark, smelly, and unhealthy place to live, a far cry from the clean, bright halls of our imagination. In conclusion, the gap between the myth and the reality of being a knight is a vast chasm. The myth is a story of freedom, honor, and adventure. The reality was a life defined by constraint, violence, and discomfort. The knight was a product of a brutal and unequal society, a tool of war whose own life was often short, painful, and fraught with anxiety. The reason we prefer the myth is simple. It's a much better story. But the truth, in all its miserable, smelly, and painful detail, is a powerful reminder that the past was a very different and often very terrible place. The shining armor was just a thin, steel veneer over a world of profound suffering. Let's dive into the mundane but miserable topic of laundry. On a military campaign, there was no organized way to wash clothes. A knight's padded arming doublet, the garment worn directly under the steel plates, would become soaked with sweat every day. It would quickly become stiff, abrasive, and overwhelmingly smelly. A knight might have one spare, but the opportunity to wash one and let it dry properly was a rare luxury. More often, he would simply put on the same disgusting, sweat-soaked garment day after day. This was not just unpleasant, it was a recipe for skin diseases, rashes, and infections. The simple, modern comfort of clean clothes was a fantasy for a man whose work uniform was a breeding ground for bacteria. Consider the role of a knight in a naval battle. While less common, knights were sometimes required to fight on ships. This was a uniquely terrifying prospect. The knight's greatest asset, his heavy armor, became his greatest liability. The rocking of the ship would make it difficult to stand and fight, and the risk of falling overboard was high. If a knight in full armor fell into the sea, he would sink like a stone. There was no chance of swimming, no hope of rescue. It was a swift and certain death by drowning. Naval combat was a chaotic affair of boarding actions, archery, and ramming. And for the heavily armored knight, it was a terrifyingly alien environment where his skills and equipment were actively working against his survival. The psychology of the melee, the chaotic press of bodies in a battle, is worth exploring. It was not a series of clean duels. It was a desperate, shoving and stabbing match. Visibility was near zero, limited to the man directly in front of you. You couldn't see flanking threats. The ground would be slick with blood and mud, and littered with bodies and discarded weapons, making footing treacherous. A knight in a melee was fighting not just the enemy, but also a rising sense of claustrophobia and panic. The goal was simply to stay upright, protect your front, and create enough space to swing your weapon. It was ugly, brutish, and utterly terrifying, a far cry from the choreographed elegance of movie sword fights. Let's talk about the specific threat of the dagger. In close quarters combat, especially against another armored opponent, a longsword was often ineffective. It was difficult to generate enough power for a killing blow against plate armor. This is where the dagger, specifically a type called a rondel dagger, came in. It had a long, stiff, needle-like point designed to punch through mail or be thrust into the small gaps in a suit of plate armor, the armpits, the groin, the eye slits of the helmet. If two knights were wrestling on the ground, the fight often came down to who could draw his dagger first and find one of these fatal gaps. It was an intimate, brutal, and personal way to kill, a desperate struggle that ended with a sharp point sliding into a vulnerable spot. The concept of glory was often a lie, a knight told himself. While tales of heroic deeds were popular, the practical rewards of war were much more tangible. A knight fought for land, for money, for political advancement, and for the loot he could strip from the dead. Glory was the noble justification for what was often just violent acquisitiveness. A lord would praise a knight for his glorious actions in battle because it encouraged other knights to fight hard, but the real reward the knight hoped for was a grant of a new manor or a share of the ransom money. The entire system was built on a foundation of self-interest, skillfully disguised under a veneer of high-minded ideals like honor and glory. Let's consider the fate of a knight who was captured and whose family could not afford the ransom. His captor had a few unpleasant options. He could try to sell the knight's contract to another noble who might be better able to extract the money. He could force the knight to fight for him as a mercenary, or If the knight was of no further use, he could simply be left to languish in a dungeon, forgotten by the world. The conditions in medieval prisons were horrific: dark, damp, filthy, and with barely enough food to sustain life. A long imprisonment was often a slow-motion death sentence. The romantic idea of noble prisoners being treated as honored guests was a fiction reserved for the very richest and most powerful captives. The role of music in a knight's life was important, but not in the way we might think. While gentle lute music might be played in a lady's chamber, the music of the battlefield was loud, percussive, and terrifying. Trumpets, horns, and drums were used to signal commands: charge, retreat, rally. They created a deafening wall of sound, designed to boost the morale of one's own troops and to intimidate the enemy. For a knight, the sound of his army's trumpets might be a source of courage, while the sound of the enemy's horns would be a signal of impending danger. It was a psychological weapon, an essential part of the sensory assault that defined the medieval battlefield. Let's talk about sleep. For a knight on campaign, a good night's sleep was a rare and precious commodity. He would likely be sleeping in a tent, on a simple straw pallet, or even on the cold, hard ground. He would be surrounded by the noise of the camp, the coughing and snoring of other men, the whinnying of horses, the distant shouts of sentries. He had to sleep in his clothes, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice in case of a surprise night attack. The constant, low-level stress and physical discomfort meant that deep, restorative sleep was almost impossible to achieve. Chronic sleep deprivation was just another hardship that drained a knight's strength and dulled his senses, making him less effective in battle. The rules of war were flexible and often depended on who you were fighting. The conventions of chivalry, such as taking noble prisoners for ransom, were generally applied when fighting other Christian knights from Western Europe. However, when fighting an enemy who was considered other, such as the Moors in Spain, the pagans in Eastern Europe, or the Muslims during the Crusades, these rules often went out the window. In these conflicts, the fighting was often far more brutal and merciless. Prisoners, even noble ones, were more likely to be executed than ransomed. It was a, quote, total war mentality, where the enemy was seen as less than human, and therefore not entitled to the protections afforded by the chivalric code. Consider the simple act of mounting a warhorse in full armor. It was not the graceful leap into the saddle we see in films. A knight in 60 pounds of steel was not particularly agile. He often needed assistance. A squire might have to help him, essentially shoving him up onto the horse's back. Sometimes, a small set of steps or a mounting block was used. This moment, which should be a symbol of a knight's power and grace, was, in reality, often a clumsy and undignified struggle. It highlighted the fundamental awkwardness of the knight's equipment. He was a fearsome weapon once he got going, but the process of getting started was anything but heroic. The siege tower was another terrifying piece of siege equipment. It was a massive wooden tower on wheels, often as tall as the castle walls themselves. It would be slowly rolled into position by teams of men, all while the defenders on the walls were desperately trying to set it on fire with flaming arrows. The top of the tower housed a drawbridge, and inside it was packed with knights and soldiers. Their job was to wait inside this flammable, wooden death trap until it reached the wall, then lower the drawbridge and charge across onto the battlements. It was an incredibly dangerous assault, with a high chance of the tower being destroyed or the attackers being cut down as they tried to cross the narrow bridge. Let's talk about the specific social hierarchy on the battlefield. Not all knights were created equal. A great lord or duke would have a large retinue and a magnificently decorated suit of armor. A poor household knight, who was essentially a salaried bodyguard for a lord, would have much simpler gear. In the line of battle, the most powerful nobles would take the most prestigious and often most dangerous positions in the front rank. Their reputation demanded it. This meant that the leadership of a medieval army was often at the greatest risk. If the king or the commanding duke was killed or captured early in the fight, it could shatter the army's morale and lead to a swift collapse. The concept of fairness in a tournament joust was also questionable. While the goal was to break your lance on the opponent's shield, some knights would aim for the head, a highly dangerous and officially discouraged tactic. Others might try to aim for the horse, hoping to unseat their opponent by injuring his mount. There were also accusations of cheating, such as using a lance that was illegally reinforced, or having your armor specially strengthened in the target areas. Behind the facade of chivalrous competition, there was a ruthless desire to win, and knights would often bend or break the rules to gain an advantage, especially when a large prize or a significant reputation boost was on the line. Let's think about the aftermath of a victory for a knight. He may have survived the battle, but he was likely battered, bruised, and utterly exhausted. His armor would be dented and in need of immediate repair. His horse might be injured. He would have to spend the next few hours or days dealing with the grim logistics of the victory, tending to his own wounds, accounting for his men, securing his share of the loot, and preparing for the next stage of the campaign. The elation of survival would be quickly replaced by the mundane and exhausting work that followed a fight. There was very little time for celebrating glory. There was only the briefest respite before the hardship and work began again. The isolation of a knight's experience is a key theme. He was isolated from his family by distance and war. He was isolated from his fellow soldiers by his noble class. And in battle, he was isolated from the world by the steel cage of his helmet. This profound sense of being alone, even when surrounded by thousands of people, must have been a significant part of his psychological reality. The code of chivalry, with its emphasis on individual honor and prowess, only reinforced this isolation. He was ultimately responsible for his own survival and his own reputation, a heavy burden to carry in a world that was so full of random violence and unpredictable danger. The role of religion as a comfort was double-edged. On one hand, the belief that God was on your side and that dying in a just cause would lead to salvation could be a powerful source of courage. A knight would pray before battle, asking for divine protection. On the other hand, religion also brought the terror of damnation. The Church taught that a man who died in a state of mortal sin would suffer eternal torment. A knight, whose profession was steeped in the sin of killing, had to constantly worry about the state of his soul. If he was killed suddenly in battle, without having a chance to confess his sins, he faced the prospect of hell. This added a layer of spiritual terror to the already profound physical terror of the battlefield. Let's consider the specific problem of fighting in a forest. Cavalry, the knight's specialty, was almost useless in dense woods. The trees would break up a charge, and low-hanging branches could knock a rider from his horse. It was the ideal terrain for an ambush by light infantry or archers, who could use the trees for cover. A knight forced to dismount and fight on foot in the woods was at a severe disadvantage. His heavy armor was cumbersome, and his limited vision made it hard to spot hidden enemies. The forest, a place of fairy tales and legend, was in military reality a death trap for the heavily armored knight, a place where all of his advantages were neutralized. The sheer physical strength required to be a knight is often underestimated. It wasn't just about being strong enough to wear the armor and swing a sword. A knight had to have incredible core strength to stay balanced on a charging horse during the shock of a lance impact. He needed powerful legs to control a massive warhorse and to fight effectively on foot. He required tremendous stamina to endure long battles or marches. This strength was built over a lifetime of relentless training that started in childhood. A knight's body was his primary tool, and it had to be conditioned to an almost superhuman level of strength and endurance just to perform the basic functions of his job. The peace that followed a war was often just as dangerous as the war itself. When armies were disbanded, the countryside was flooded with unemployed soldiers with no skills other than violence. Banditry would skyrocket. Feuds between noble families, which had been suppressed during the larger war, would erupt again into local conflicts. For a knight, the end of a major war didn't necessarily mean a return to safety and quiet. It could mean a shift from organized, large-scale conflict to a more chaotic and unpredictable landscape of small-scale raids, ambushes, and assassinations. There was rarely a true, lasting peace in the medieval world. In the final analysis, the knight was a specialist, a human weapon system designed for a very specific type of warfare, the heavy cavalry charge. But as warfare evolved, his specialty became less and less relevant. The rise of disciplined infantry, the dominance of the longbow, and the invention of gunpowder all conspired to make him obsolete. The knight's refusal or inability to adapt to these new realities was the cause of his downfall. He was a product of a specific time and place, and when that time passed, he became a relic. The tragedy of the late medieval knight is that of a man who has dedicated his entire life to mastering a skill set that the world no longer needs. Let's explore the unglamorous reality of castle guard duty. Not every knight was on the front lines. Many were assigned to garrison remote castles, a role that was mind-numbingly boring but essential. This involved endless hours of standing watch on the castle walls in all kinds of weather, staring out at the same unchanging landscape. The days would be filled with routine drills, equipment maintenance, and the petty squabbles of a small, isolated community. It was a life of extreme monotony, punctuated by the occasional moment of terror if an enemy force actually appeared. For a young knight dreaming of glory, being assigned to garrison duty in some forgotten border outpost was a crushing disappointment and a miserable waste of his training. The horseshoes were a small but critical piece of technology. A horse that threw a shoe on a march would quickly become lame, especially on the poor quality roads of the period. This meant that every army had to travel with blacksmiths, or farriers, who were skilled in shoeing horses. If a knight's horse lost a shoe in the middle of nowhere, it was a serious problem. He would have to stop, find the farrier in the baggage train, and wait while the horse was reshod. It was another one of the countless mundane, logistical frustrations that could delay a march and add to the daily grind of a campaign. The success of a multi-ton cavalry charge could depend on a few simple iron nails. Let's consider the impact of scars. In a culture that prized martial prowess, scars could be seen as a mark of honor, a testament to a knight's experience in battle. However, a disfiguring facial scar could also be a social liability. Furthermore, the scars were a permanent reminder of a moment of extreme violence and pain. They were a physical map of a knight's near-death experiences. While some might have worn them with pride, for others they were likely a source of psychological trauma, a constant, visible trigger for the memories of the terrifying events that caused them. The scarred warrior is a romantic image, but the reality behind it is one of profound physical and emotional pain. The role of hunting dogs was crucial to a nobleman's life. Large packs of specialized dogs were used for hunting everything from deer to wild boar. A knight would often be an expert huntsman, and the hunt was seen as a form of training for war. However, these dogs were also a huge expense and responsibility. They had to be fed, housed in large kennels, and trained by a professional huntsman. A good pack of hunting hounds was a status symbol, another way for a lord or knight to display his wealth and power. For the pages and squires, caring for these dogs was often one of their many thankless chores. Let's talk about the specific discomfort of wearing mail armor or chainmail. Before the widespread use of plate armor, knights were protected by a full suit of interlocking iron rings. Mail was more flexible than plate, but it had significant downsides. It offered very little protection against blunt force trauma. A blow from a mace would still break the bones underneath. It was also incredibly heavy, with all the weight hanging directly from the shoulders, causing immense fatigue. And every single ring had to be meticulously cleaned and oiled to prevent rust. A spot of rust could spread and weaken the entire garment. Plate armor was an improvement, But for centuries, the knight's primary defense was a heavy, uncomfortable, and high-maintenance metal shirt. The medieval legal concept of outlawry was terrifying. A person declared an outlaw was considered outside the protection of the law. This meant anyone could legally kill them without fear of punishment. In fact, there was often a reward for doing so. A knight who fell into serious disfavor with his king could be declared an outlaw. He would be forced to flee his home and lands and live as a fugitive, hunted by bounty hunters and his former peers. His life would become a desperate struggle for survival in the wilderness, his noble status rendered utterly meaningless. The famous story of Robin Hood romanticizes this existence, but the reality for an outlaw was one of constant fear, hunger, and isolation. Let's consider the role of spies and scouts. Information was a critical weapon in medieval warfare. Before a battle, a commander would send out scouts, often light cavalrymen or knights on fast horses, to reconnoiter the enemy's position, size, and movements. This was incredibly dangerous work. A scout operated alone or in a small group, deep in enemy territory. If caught, he was unlikely to be treated as a prisoner of war. He would be interrogated, likely under torture, for any information he possessed, and then unceremoniously executed. The intelligence he gathered could win or lose the coming battle, but he had to risk everything to get it. The sheer amount of time a knight spent practicing was enormous. From his childhood as a page to his death, a knight's life was one of constant training. He would spend hours every day practicing with the sword, the lance, and other weapons. He would spend hours in the saddle, mastering the intricate movements of mounted combat. This dedication was necessary to maintain the high level of skill and physical conditioning required for his job. But it also meant that he had little time for anything else. A knight was a specialist, and his life was a narrow one, focused almost entirely on the arts of war. It was a life of obsessive, repetitive, and exhausting practice. The river crossing was a major tactical problem for a medieval army. Few bridges were strong enough to support the weight of a whole army, especially its heavy cavalry and baggage train. This meant armies often had to ford rivers at shallow points. This was a moment of extreme vulnerability. The army would be strung out, and the soldiers and horses would be struggling in the current. A clever enemy could launch an attack while the army was halfway across, with devastating results. A knight, weighed down by his armor, was at a particular disadvantage. If his horse lost its footing in the current, he could be swept away and drowned. The seemingly simple act of crossing a river was one of the most dangerous maneuvers in a campaign. Ultimately, the knight represents a paradox. He was a symbol of order, the enforcer of the king's peace and the feudal hierarchy. Yet his personal life and profession were steeped in chaos, violence, and disorder. He was supposed to embody the Christian virtue of humility, yet his class was defined by immense pride and a constant striving for status. He was a figure of romance, yet his reality was one of the most unromantic existences imaginable. This deep, unresolvable conflict between the ideal and the real is what makes the knight such a fascinating figure. And it is also what makes it clear that, for the man living that life, it was a deeply difficult, contradictory, and miserable existence. Let's consider the specific annoyance of insects. In a military camp during the summer, flies and mosquitoes would have been a relentless plague. With open latrines, animal dung, and garbage pits everywhere, the camp was a perfect breeding ground. For a knight, these pests were more than just an annoyance. Flies would swarm around his food and on any open wounds, spreading disease. Mosquitoes would bite relentlessly, causing itching and discomfort that would be impossible to scratch while wearing armor. It's a small detail, but the constant torment of biting and disease-carrying insects would have added another layer of misery to the already unpleasant experience of life on campaign. The tradition of fostering had a profound psychological impact. Sending a 7-year-old boy away to be raised in another household was a common practice among the nobility. While it was intended to build alliances and toughen the boy up, it also meant he was raised without the emotional support of his immediate family. His relationship with his own parents could become distant and formal. He had to learn to survive and thrive in a new family, where he was essentially a guest and a servant. This early experience of separation and the need to constantly prove his worth in a strange environment would have shaped his entire emotional development, likely fostering a deep sense of self-reliance, but also a profound emotional guardedness. Let's talk about the specific weapon known as the Goedendag, or Good Day. It was a uniquely brutal weapon used by Flemish infantry. It was a combination of a spear and a club, a thick wooden staff with a metal spike on the end. It was simple to make, but incredibly effective against knights. The club part could be used to bludgeon a knight or break his horse's legs, and the spike was perfect for thrusting into the gaps of armor or finishing a downed opponent. The weapon's name is grimly ironic. It was a good day for the peasant infantryman who used it, but a very bad day for the knight who found himself on the receiving end of it. It symbolizes the rise of effective, low-cost infantry weapons that challenge knightly dominance. The concept of a just war was important to the church and to the knights themselves. A war was considered just if it was declared by a legitimate authority, had a just cause, like defending the realm, and was fought with the right intentions. Knights felt more comfortable, morally, fighting in a war they believed to be just. However, the definition of a just cause was often incredibly flexible. A lord's petty ambition to seize a neighbor's land could easily be framed as a just defense of his own rights. This allowed knights to participate in what were essentially wars of aggression while maintaining the comforting belief that they were fighting on the side of righteousness. The just war theory was often a tool of political justification. Let's think about the sheer boredom of a long sea voyage, for instance, to the Holy Land for a crusade. The journey could take months. The knight would be crammed onto a small, smelly, and overcrowded ship with hundreds of other soldiers and horses. The diet would be monotonous, consisting of hardtack and salted meat. Fresh water was strictly rationed. The ship would be tossed about by storms, causing rampant seasickness. There was nothing to do but wait, play dice, and try to avoid the fights that inevitably broke out in the cramped conditions. It was a miserable and dangerous ordeal that had to be endured before the even greater misery of the campaign on land could begin. The relationship between a knight and the merchants of a town was often tense. While knights were a source of business, they were also seen as arrogant, violent, and unreliable customers. A knight might commission an expensive piece of equipment from a craftsman and then be slow to pay, or refuse to pay altogether, and there was little the craftsman could do about it. The urban, commercial world of the towns, with its focus on contracts and cash, was often at odds with the rural, feudal world of the knights, with its focus on status and martial honor. The two groups needed each other, but there was a deep cultural divide and a great deal of mutual suspicion. Consider the specific physical toll of jousting on the body. A jouster had to wear even heavier and more specialized armor than for battle, which could weigh up to 100 pounds. This armor was designed to protect against a single massive impact from one direction. The repeated shocks of the lance strikes, even when they didn't unhorse a man, would have been brutal on the spine and joints. Modern studies of skeletons of medieval knights have shown evidence of massive trauma, repeated fractures, and severe arthritis, particularly in the back, shoulders, and legs. A successful career as a tournament knight meant systematically destroying your own body for fame and fortune. The practice of scotage, or shield money, reveals a lot about the changing nature of knighthood. By the later Middle Ages, many knights preferred not to fulfill their military service in person. Instead, they would pay a tax, the scotage, to their lord. The lord could then use this money to hire professional mercenary soldiers, who were often more reliable and less troublesome than his own feudal vassals. This shows that the primary role of many knights was shifting from being a warrior to being a land manager. The knightly class was becoming less of a military force and more of a social and economic one. The very act of paying to avoid fighting was a sign that the classic age of the knight was coming to an end. Let's examine the arrow storm. This was a tactic used by English longbowmen, where they would not aim at individual targets, but would fire their arrows high into the air, to fall in a dense, plunging volley on a specific area. A single archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows a minute. An army with several thousand archers could rain down tens of thousands of arrows in a very short time. For a knight standing under this, it would have been a terrifying experience. The sky would suddenly darken, and there would be a sound like a great flock of birds, followed by the deadly rain of steel-tipped shafts. It was an impersonal, industrial form of killing that a knight's individual bravery was powerless against. The bond between knights who fought together, known as, quote, brothers in arms, could be incredibly strong. They would swear oaths to support each other, share their loot, and defend each other's honor. This was a vital support system in a dangerous and unpredictable world. However, this bond could also be a source of conflict. If two brothers in arms found themselves on opposite sides of a civil war, their personal oath would be in direct conflict with their feudal oath to their lord. It was a heartbreaking and often impossible choice. The very relationships that provided comfort and security could also become a source of the deepest moral and emotional turmoil. Let's consider the specific problem of a wounded horse on the battlefield. A horse with a broken leg or a severe belly wound could not be saved. The knight or his squire would be faced with the grim task of putting the animal out of its misery. This meant a quick, efficient kill with a dagger or sword. For a knight who relied on his horse and had likely spent years with the animal, this was a difficult and emotional task, but a necessary one. It was another moment of brutal pragmatism in a world that had little room for sentimentality. The loss was not just emotional. It was a devastating financial blow that could take years to recover from. The medieval tournament circuit was a real phenomenon. A knight looking to make a name for himself would travel from tournament to tournament across Europe, competing for prizes and reputation. It was a life on the road, similar to that of a modern professional athlete. He would travel with his squire, horses, and equipment, living in inns or being hosted by local lords. It sounds romantic, but it was a hard and precarious existence. A string of losses could be financially ruinous. An injury could end his career in an instant. It was a high-risk, high-reward lifestyle that attracted ambitious and often desperate young knights. The rules of engagement were often set before a battle or tournament. The commanders of the two armies might meet and agree on certain terms. For example, they might agree on which types of weapons were forbidden, or declare that all captured knights would be ransomed rather than killed. However, these agreements were fragile. In the heat of battle, they were often ignored, and a commander who was losing badly might decide to abandon the agreed-upon rules out of desperation. The chivalrous agreements were a thin veneer of civility over a fundamentally brutal activity, and that veneer could be shattered at any moment. Let's talk about the specific challenges of fighting in hot climates, such as during the Crusades in the Middle East. A knight from Northern Europe was completely unprepared for the intense heat. His armor, already an oven in a temperate climate, became a life-threatening death trap. He was also susceptible to local diseases, to which he had no immunity. The tactics of his Saracen opponents, who often favored light cavalry and hit-and-run strategies, were perfectly suited to the terrain and climate. The heavily armored European knight was slow, clumsy, and easily exhausted in this new environment. The Crusades were a logistical and physical nightmare for the knights who participated in them. The cult of the relic was a powerful force in a knight's life. It was widely believed that the physical remains of a saint, or objects associated with them, held miraculous power. Knights would carry small relics into battle, believing they offered divine protection. Churches and monasteries would vie to possess famous relics, as they attracted pilgrims and donations. A knight might make a long and dangerous pilgrimage to a shrine to pray for success in battle or to give thanks for surviving a war. This deep belief in the tangible power of sacred objects was a central part of a knight's spiritual worldview, a way of trying to find some measure of control and security in a violent and uncertain world. The Grand Bastard of Burgundy is a great example of the knightly paradox. He was one of the most famous and celebrated tournament champions of the 15th century. As an illegitimate son, he had no lands to inherit, so he had to make his way in the world through his martial skill. He was the living embodiment of the chivalric hero, winning fame and fortune through his prowess. However, his success depended on his participation in an incredibly violent and dangerous sport that systematically destroyed his body. He was a celebrity, but his fame was built on a foundation of pain and a constant risk of death. He was the myth made real, and that reality was brutal. Let's consider the specific problem of friendly fire. On a chaotic battlefield, with poor visibility and clouds of dust and smoke, it was easy to make a mistake. A knight could easily be struck down by an arrow from his own side's archers, or be trampled by a cavalry charge of his own comrades. The use of heraldry was supposed to prevent this, but in the confusion of a melee, it was difficult to identify anyone clearly. The battlefield was a place of indiscriminate violence, and death could come just as easily from a friend's mistake as from an enemy's weapon. The language barrier was a significant problem during large multinational campaigns like the Crusades. An army might be composed of knights from France, England, Germany, and Italy, all speaking different languages. This made communication and coordination incredibly difficult. Commands could be misunderstood, leading to tactical disasters. Tensions and rivalries between the different national groups were common, often breaking out into open brawls. The ideal of a unified Christian army was a fiction. In reality, it was a fractious and often dysfunctional coalition of competing groups who could barely speak to one another. The coat of plates was a precursor to full plate armor. It was a leather or cloth garment with steel plates riveted to the inside. It was an attempt to provide more protection than mail, but it was heavy and relatively inflexible. It's a good example of the constant arms race that was taking place in the Middle Ages. As weapons became more effective, armor had to evolve to counter them. A knight had to constantly invest in the latest military technology to stay protected. Falling behind in this arms race could be fatal. His survival depended on his ability to afford the best and most up-to-date protective gear. So we see the knight not as a single static figure, but as a constantly evolving role. The early knight in his mail shirt was very different from the late medieval knight in his full plate. The challenges he faced changed over the centuries, but one thing remained constant: the immense gap between the romantic ideal and the harsh reality. Whether he was fighting Vikings with an axe or facing English longbowmen, his life was one of physical hardship, financial worry, and the ever-present shadow of a violent death. The details changed, but the fundamental misery of the job remained the same. Let's consider the specific role of the herald. These were the official experts on coats of arms and genealogy. At a tournament, the heralds would announce the knights, reciting their lineage and famous deeds. In war, they acted as messengers between armies, as their office was supposed to grant them immunity. They were the keepers of the entire system of chivalric honor. However, their role highlights the performative nature of knighthood. The herald's job was to publicly present the knight as a heroic figure, to build his brand. They were the public relations experts of the medieval world, skillfully crafting the myth in real time, even as the knights themselves were living the brutal reality. The simple act of getting old was a knight's greatest enemy. His profession required peak physical strength and fitness. As he aged, his strength would wane, his reflexes would slow, and his old injuries would ache more and more. A knight in his 40s was already a veteran, and by his 50s, he was likely past his prime for frontline combat. If he had not secured a comfortable position as a landowner or commander, his future was bleak. He could no longer compete effectively in tournaments or survive the rigors of a campaign. He was a warrior in a world that had no place for old warriors, a professional whose skills had a tragically short expiration date. Let's talk about the specific humiliation of being captured by common soldiers. If a knight was captured by another knight, he could expect to be treated with a certain level of professional courtesy, as a future source of ransom. But if he was unhorsed and surrounded by peasant infantry, the situation was very different. They had no interest in the niceties of chivalry. They would see him as a symbol of the oppressive noble class and a source of immediate loot. They would strip him of his armor and valuables, and were just as likely to kill him out of spite or class hatred as to try and ransom him. For a proud knight, being defeated and humbled by low-born commoners was the ultimate disgrace. The role of the church in banking is an interesting side note. The church officially forbade usury, the lending of money at interest. This meant that knights and lords who needed to borrow money often had to turn to non-Christian moneylenders, or to groups like the Knights Templar, who developed sophisticated international banking systems to get around the rules. A knight trying to finance his equipment or pay a ransom would find himself entangled in a complex and often predatory financial world. Getting out of debt was incredibly difficult, and many knights spent their entire lives owing money to powerful institutions or individuals who held their financial future in their hands. The chevauchée was a common military strategy that was particularly brutal. It was not about seeking a decisive battle, but about systematically devastating a region of enemy territory. A force of knights and soldiers would ride through the countryside, burning crops, destroying villages, killing livestock, and terrorizing the civilian population. The goal was to destroy the enemy's economic base and demoralize them. For a knight participating in this, it was not glorious combat. It was a campaign of organized arson and destruction. It was one of the clearest examples of how the rules of chivalry did not apply to the common people, whose lives and property were considered legitimate military targets. Let's consider the specific challenge of fighting on a bridge. A bridge was a strategic choke point, and battles were often fought to control them. For knights, fighting on a narrow bridge was a nightmare. A cavalry charge was impossible. They had to dismount and fight on foot in a cramped, linear space. There was no room to maneuver, no way to retreat, and a constant risk of being pushed off the edge into the river below. It negated all the advantages of heavy cavalry and turned the fight into a bloody, grinding scrum. The famous defense of the bridge at the Battle of Stirling Bridge by the Scots against English knights is a perfect example of how a bridge could become a death trap for an armored force. The concept of mercenary knights shows the commercialization of warfare. These were knights who did not fight out of feudal obligation, but for a paycheck. They would sell their services to any lord or king who could afford them. They were professionals, often highly skilled and experienced, but their loyalty was to their wallet, not to a cause. A lord who hired mercenaries had to be careful. If he stopped paying them, they might switch sides or start looting his own territory. The rise of the mercenary knight was a sign that the old feudal system was breaking down, being replaced by a more transactional, cash-based approach to warfare. The practice of taking trophies from a defeated opponent was common. This could be his sword, his helmet, or the banner from his lance. These were displayed as proof of a knight's victory and prowess. It was a very personal and direct way of building a reputation. However, it also highlights the brutal, competitive nature of the knightly world. Your honor was built upon the dishonor of your defeated rivals. Every trophy on your wall represented a man you had bested in a violent confrontation. It was a zero-sum game, where one man's glory was directly linked to another's defeat, humiliation, and often his death. Let's talk about the specific problem of a horse panicking in battle. A war horse was trained for combat, but it was still an animal. The noise, the smells, and the chaos of a battle could cause even a well-trained horse to panic. It might refuse to charge, bolt in the opposite direction, or start bucking, trying to throw its rider. A knight whose horse was out of control was completely helpless. He couldn't fight effectively and was at the mercy of the enemy. The bond between a knight and his horse was one of trust, but that trust could be broken in an instant by the overwhelming terror of the battlefield, with fatal consequences for the rider. So the final image of the knight should not be one of shining steel, but of dented, rusty iron. It should not be a sound of glorious trumpets, but of the screams of the wounded and the endless clang of metal. It should not be the scent of courtly perfume, but the overwhelming stench of sweat, mud, and death. The knight was a man trapped by his profession, by his equipment, by his social code, and by the brutal realities of his time. To remember him as a fairy tale hero is to do him a disservice. To understand why his life truly sucked is to begin to understand the man himself. Let's consider the simple act of breathing. Inside a sealed helmet, the carbon dioxide from a knight's own exhalations would build up. As he exerted himself, breathing harder and faster, the air quality would rapidly degrade. This could lead to shortness of breath, dizziness, and a feeling of suffocation. This air hunger would have been a constant source of panic, a desperate, primal need that the very armor designed to protect him was actively thwarting. Every breath was a struggle, a battle within the battle, fought against his own protective gear. This physiological reality is a powerful symbol of the knight's predicament. His strengths were also his greatest weaknesses. The medieval law of arms was a complex and often unwritten code that governed warfare between nobles. It dictated the rules for ransoms, the treatment of prisoners, and the division of loot. However, it was not a system of justice. It was a system of professional courtesy among members of the same elite club. It was designed to regulate their violent profession and make it more predictable and profitable. It explicitly did not apply to common soldiers or civilians. This law was a clear expression of the class-based nature of medieval society, a set of rules for the wolves that offered no protection to the sheep. Let's talk about the specific feeling of being hit by an arrow. Even if the arrow didn't penetrate the armor, the impact force was significant. It would have felt like being hit with a hammer. It could dent the armor, knock a knight off balance, and leave a massive bruise. And if the arrow found a gap, or was fired from a powerful enough bow to punch through a thinner section of plate, the wound was horrific. Barbed arrowheads were designed to be difficult to remove. A surgeon would have to cut a larger wound to extract it, causing immense damage and increasing the risk of infection. The arrow storm was not just terrifying, it was a source of uniquely nasty injuries. The pressure to marry for money or land was immense, especially for a poorer knight. He might find himself betrothed to a woman he had never met, purely because her dowry could pay off his debts or provide him with a much-needed estate. The romantic ideal of marrying for love was a luxury very few knights could afford. His marriage was a business decision, a cold calculation of profit and loss. This meant many knights were trapped in loveless, purely functional relationships, another aspect of their lives where personal desire was subordinate to practical necessity. The happily ever after of the fairy tales was a cruel joke to a man whose marriage contract was a financial statement. Let's consider the specific challenges of fighting at night. While large battles were usually fought during the day, night attacks and skirmishes were common. This was a terrifying prospect. In the darkness, visibility was almost non-existent. It was nearly impossible to tell friend from foe. The familiar landscape became a confusing and threatening maze. The sounds of the night, the snapping of a twig, a whispered word, could signal a deadly threat. A knight, already hampered by his armor, was at an even greater disadvantage in the dark. Night combat was a game of stealth, confusion, and blind luck, a true nightmare scenario for any soldier. The freelance knight, literally a freelance, was a knight not sworn to any particular lord. He was a mercenary who offered his lance in service to anyone who would pay. This sounds like a life of freedom, but it was one of extreme insecurity. He had no land to fall back on, no guaranteed income. He lived from contract to contract. If there was a period of peace, he was unemployed and destitute. This forced many freelancers to turn to banditry to survive. The freelance knight was not a noble adventurer. He was a member of the medieval gig economy, constantly hustling for his next dangerous job, with no safety net whatsoever. Let's talk about the specific misery of dysentery, the bloody flux. It was the single greatest killer in most medieval military campaigns. It was caused by bacteria and contaminated food and water. The symptoms were horrific: severe abdominal cramps, fever, and bloody diarrhea. It led to rapid dehydration and weakness. A strong knight could be reduced to a helpless, dying man in a matter of days. There was no effective treatment. It was a miserable, undignified, and agonizing way to die. The grim irony for a knight was that he could spend a fortune on armor and a lifetime on training, only to be killed by a sip of bad water from a camp well. The practice of blazoning is the formal, verbal description of a coat of arms. Heralds had to learn this complex, technical language to describe coats of arms accurately. This system was essential because it allowed a knight's identity to be recorded and recognized. But it also shows how codified and rigid the knightly world was. Your identity was your lineage, represented by a set of symbols. You were not just an individual, you were the current bearer of a specific coat of arms, with all the history and obligations that came with it. It was a constant reminder that you were part of a larger, older system, and your individual identity was secondary to your place within that structure. Let's consider the specific problem of fighting uphill. It sounds simple, but it was a major tactical blunder to launch a cavalry charge uphill. The horses would tire quickly, losing all their momentum. The knights would be fighting against gravity, making them slower and less effective. Meanwhile, the defenders at the top of the hill would have all the advantages, able to rain down missiles and charge down upon the exhausted attackers. A commander who ordered his knights to charge uphill was either incompetent or desperate. For the knight, it was a suicidal task, a grueling, demoralizing struggle that almost always ended in a costly and humiliating defeat. The end of a knight's career was often pathetic, not glorious. Unless he was a great lord, he did not retire to a life of luxury. If he was crippled by an old wound or simply worn down by age, he might be given a small pension or a minor administrative role by his lord, a form of charity. Others would rely on the kindness of their children. Many ended their days in poverty, their past deeds forgotten. The monasteries were a final refuge for some, a place to live out their last days in prayer and repentance for their violent lives. The heroic figure of the stories rarely had a heroic ending in the real world. His end was usually quiet, painful, and poor. So we have dismantled the myth, piece by painful piece. We have taken the shining suit of armor and revealed the sweaty, exhausted, and often terrified man inside. We have replaced the grand castle with a cold, drafty, and smelly reality. We have traded the glorious quest for the brutal, muddy, and financially ruinous business of medieval warfare. The Knight of Legend is a powerful and enduring fantasy, a testament to our love for stories of clear-cut heroism and noble adventure. But he is just that, a fantasy. He is a character from a book, not a man from history. The real medieval knight was a professional soldier, trapped in one of the most demanding and dangerous jobs ever conceived. His life was a constant struggle against a host of enemies, not just the men he fought on the battlefield, but also disease, debt, the weather, political intrigue, and the crushing weight of his own equipment and social obligations. It was a life of profound discomfort, ruled by a code of honor that was more often a guideline for performance than a true moral compass. He was a walking, talking paradox, a symbol of Christian virtue whose trade was killing, a member of the landed elite who was often broke. To understand this reality is not to diminish the past, but to appreciate its complexity. It allows us to see these figures not as one-dimensional heroes, but as human beings, subject to the same pressures, fears, and frustrations that we are, just amplified by a world of extreme violence and rigid hierarchy. It replaces a simple, satisfying myth with a more complicated and ultimately more interesting truth. The truth is that the systems and structures that governed a knight's life were almost perfectly designed to make it as miserable as possible, and the fact that anyone survived it at all is, perhaps, the most heroic thing about them. The knightly myth tells us more about the people who created it than it does about the knights themselves. It was created by a noble class to justify its own existence, to put a glamorous spin on its role as the violent enforcers of the status quo. And we continue to tell this story because we want to believe in a world where honor is real, where bravery is always rewarded, and where a single good man in shining armor can make everything right. It's a beautiful and comforting lie, and it's one we have been telling ourselves for nearly 1,000 years. It's a story that is much, much better than the truth. So the next time you see a movie or read a book about a dashing knight, remember the reality hidden beneath the glamour. Remember the heat, the weight, and the rust of the armor. Remember the constant, grinding fear of disease and debt. Remember the brutal, unchivalrous reality of the battlefield and the endless, crushing boredom of the castle. Remember the man who was trained from childhood to be a weapon, who lived in constant pain, and who was more likely to die from a stomach bug than from a sword. The myth is entertaining, but the reality is a far more powerful story about human endurance in the face of a truly terrible job. The knight's world was not a fantasy landscape. It was a real place, filled with mud, blood, and profound inequality. The knight was not a hero on a quest. He was a man doing a job. And that job, for all the reasons we have explored, was one of the worst jobs in history. It was a life sentence of discomfort, danger, and debt, all wrapped up in a thin, fragile layer of honor. The greatest battle a knight ever fought was not against a dragon or a rival champion. It was against the miserable, grinding reality of his own daily existence. And perhaps that is the ultimate reason it sucked to be a knight. It was the immense, unbridgeable gap between the expectation and the reality. He was told he was a noble, a hero, a figure of romance and power. But he lived a life that was anything but. He was a walking contradiction, a man whose entire identity was a performance, a struggle to live up to an impossible ideal in a world that constantly conspired to crush him. The psychic weight of that contradiction may have been even heavier than the 60 pounds of steel he wore on his back. The romance of the knight is a powerful drug. It is a story of a simpler, more honorable time. But it is an illusion. The medieval world was not simpler, it was brutally complex. And it was not more honorable. Its systems of honor were designed to perpetuate violence and inequality. Stripping away the romance allows us to see the past more clearly and to understand the immense hardships that ordinary and extraordinary people had to endure just to survive. The knight's story is not one of fantasy, but one of survival against overwhelming odds. The knight has been a symbol of heroism for centuries, but perhaps we should see him as a different kind of symbol. He is a symbol of the human capacity to endure the unendurable. He is a symbol of how even the most glamorous and romanticized roles in history were, upon closer inspection, filled with misery, pain, and suffering. He is a testament to the fact that the good old days were, for the people who actually had to live through them, usually anything but. He is the ultimate example of a job that looked great on paper, but was, in reality, a nightmare. So the final truth about why it sucked to be a knight is this. His life was a trap. He was trapped in his armor, trapped by his oaths, trapped by his debts, and trapped by a social code that demanded he be a hero in a world that had little room for heroism. He was, in the end, less a master of his own destiny and more a prisoner of it. The shining armor was not a symbol of his glory, but the very cage in which he lived, and, more often than not, died.